They sent me a fine for my cabin being not upscale enough for ecological standards. I thought it was just a small issue. Who would have guessed that a 60-year-old wooden house could threaten an entire modern neighborhood? I'm sitting here on the porch of the cabin my grandfather left me, looking out at the crystal-clear lake, wondering when preserving tradition became a crime. These new neighbors don't realize that this cabin is older than their entire HOA board combined, and they're about to learn why that's not something to underestimate. Have you ever had neighbors mess with you using regulations? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I bet your story is just as wild as mine. The whole mess started on a Tuesday morning when I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. $750 for negatively impacting the aesthetic, ecological standards of the community. I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. My cabin, the same rustic log structure where my grandfather taught me to fish, where my father proposed to my mother, where I'd planned to bring my daughter Lana for summers after the divorce, was apparently an eyesore, threatening the environmental harmony of Lakeshore Harmony development. Lakeshore Harmony was one of those eco-friendly communities that had sprouted up around the lake over the past couple of years. Every house looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine, all solar panels, native stone, and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to blend seamlessly with nature. My cabin, with its weathered logs and creaky porch, stuck out like a sore thumb among these modern marvels. I'd watched them go up one by one, replacing the old fishing camps and summer cottages that used to dot the shoreline. Apparently, I was the last holdout. The letter was signed by Vera Langford, chairwoman of the Lakeshore Harmony Homeowners Association. I'd never heard of her, but according to the letterhead, she was also a representative of Ecolux Properties, the development company behind the neighborhood transformation. The fine was for violating Section 12 of the Community Ecological Standards, which required all structures to maintain visual harmony with the established environmental aesthetic. Translation: my cabin wasn't pretty enough for their Instagram-worthy neighborhood. I called the number on the letterhead and got a receptionist with a voice so perky it made my teeth hurt. Ecolux Properties, where luxury meets sustainability. How can I help you create your dream eco lifestyle today? When I explained about the fine, her tone shifted to something more professional but equally rehearsed. Oh yes, Mr. Granger. Mrs. Langford has been expecting your call. She has an opening this Thursday at 2 p.m. Will that work for your schedule? The way she said it made it sound less like a question and more like a royal summons. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the intervening days researching HOA laws and property rights, trying to figure out how a cabin that had been my family for 3 generations could suddenly be subject to regulations that didn't exist when it was built. What I found wasn't encouraging. Apparently, when the area was rezoned for the Lakeshore Harmony development, all existing structures were grandfathered in, but could be subject to community improvement standards if they significantly detracted from the overall development goals. It was legal jargon designed to sound official while meaning absolutely nothing concrete. The Ecolux offices were located in what used to be the old bait shop at the north end of the lake. Now it was a gleaming glass and steel structure that looked like an Apple store had a baby with a greenhouse. Everything was white surfaces, potted plants, and motivational posters about sustainable living. I felt like I needed to wipe my feet on the way in, even though I'd driven there straight from my software engineering job where I wore khakis and button-downs every day. Vera Langford was waiting for me in a conference room that smelled like vanilla candles and ambition. She was exactly what I had expected. Mid-30s, blonde hair pulled back in a power ponytail, wearing what looked like a designer yoga outfit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her smile was the kind they teach in sales seminars, bright and confident but never quite reaching her eyes. Mr. Granger, so wonderful to finally meet you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. She gestured to a chair across from her like she was doing me a favor by letting me sit in her presence. I hope we can work together to find a solution that benefits everyone in our beautiful community. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. Vera explained how the Lakeshore Harmony development was competing for the State Ecological Community Award, a prestigious recognition that would bring tourism and investment to the area. My cabin, while charming in its own rustic way, was preventing the community from achieving the visual cohesion necessary to win the award. Think of it as upgrading from a flip phone to a smartphone, she said with that same practiced smile. It's still functional, but it doesn't really fit with modern expectations, does it? When I pointed out that my cabin predated her entire development by 40 years, her smile flickered for just a moment. Well, yes, of course, but times change, Mr. Granger. Laws change. Standards change. We have to adapt or get left behind. She slid a folder across the table. "I've taken the liberty of having our architects draw up some renovation plans that would bring your property up to community standards. Solar panels, native stone facade, expanded windows to maximize the lake view. It would be stunning and completely covered by our community improvement fund." I flipped through the plans and my heart sank. What they were proposing wasn't renovation. It was complete demolition and reconstruction. There would be nothing left of the original cabin, nothing left of my grandfather's handiwork, or my family's history. "What if I don't want to renovate?" I asked. Vera's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Well, then we'll have to explore other options to ensure community compliance. I do hope it doesn't come to that." I left that meeting with a queasy feeling in my stomach and a new appreciation for how a snake might feel while being slowly swallowed by a larger snake. Vera Langford wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was a woman with a plan. And my cabin was apparently standing in the way of that plan. As I drove home, past the pristine lawns and architectural marvels of Lakeshore Harmony, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. The war for my cabin was just beginning, and I had the sinking suspicion that Vera Langford didn't fight fair. I thought I could reason with Vera Langford. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating just how creative someone could get with environmental regulations when they really wanted your property gone. 1 week after our meeting, I found another letter taped to my door, this time for $3,200. The violation? Critical groundwater contamination risk from obsolete septic systems. Apparently, my 60-year-old cabin was now a toxic waste site waiting to happen. The letter came with official-looking documentation from something called the Regional Environmental Compliance Initiative, complete with scientific jargon that could choke a chemistry professor. According to their assessment, my cabin's septic system was leaching dangerous levels of nitrates into the groundwater, threatening the delicate ecosystem that Lakeshore Harmony had worked so hard to preserve. The only solution was immediate remediation at my expense, or voluntary relocation with community assistance. I'm a software engineer, not an environmental scientist, but I know BS when I see it. My septic system had been inspected and certified just 2 years ago when I'd refinanced the cabin after my divorce. The county health department had given it a clean bill of health, and I had the paperwork to prove it. But apparently, the Regional Environmental Compliance Initiative operated under different standards than the County College of Science do. That standard that seemed specifically designed to target my property. A little internet research revealed that the Regional Environmental Compliance Initiative was a subsidiary of Ecolux Properties. Vera Langford wasn't just trying to strong-arm me with HOA regulations. She'd created her own environmental enforcement agency to give her threats the veneer of scientific legitimacy. It was brilliant, diabolical, and probably completely legal. I was starting to understand that I wasn't dealing with a simple neighborhood busybody. Vera Langford was a professional, and this was clearly not her first rodeo. I decided to do some reconnaissance around the neighborhood, talking to other residents to see if anyone else had received similar environmental citations. What I found was disturbing. In the past 18 months, 12 families had sold their properties to Ecolux Properties after receiving various violations. The Hendersons had been cited for invasive landscaping species. The Kowalskis had been fined for non-compliant roof materials affecting solar reflection path. The pattern was always the same: escalating fines, increasingly bizarre violations, and eventually a generous buyout offer that looked attractive compared to the mounting legal fees and penalties. The more I learned about Vera Langford, the more impressive and terrifying she became. She had a master's degree in environmental science and an MBA in real estate development. She transformed 3 other lake communities in the region using the same playbook: buy in, establish environmental and aesthetic standards, systematically eliminate non-compliant properties, then develop luxury eco-resorts that attracted wealthy tourists and secondhand buyers. Lakeshore Harmony was just her latest project, and according to local real estate records, she'd already increased property values by 40% in less than 2 years. But there was something else I discovered during my research that didn't fit the pattern of a simple real estate developer maximizing profits. In 1995, when Vera was 12 years old, her family's cabin had been demolished to make way for a shopping mall development. The local newspaper had run a story about it, complete with a photo of young Vera crying in front of the bulldozers that were destroying her childhood home. That photo explained everything. Vera wasn't just a ruthless developer, she was someone who'd been traumatized by losing her own piece of paradise and had spent her adult life making sure that never happened to anyone else by controlling the process herself. Understanding Vera's motivation didn't make my situation any better, but it did help me realize what I was really up against. This wasn't just about property values or environmental standards, it was personal. Vera saw my cabin as a threat to her vision of a perfect lakeside community, and she had the resources, the expertise, and the emotional investment to make my life miserable until I gave up and sold. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink, I made a decision. Vera Langford might have the money, the organization, and the legal expertise, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose, except the one thing that mattered most to him. My cabin wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was my connection to my family, my refuge from the chaos of divorce and career uncertainty, and the one place where I felt like I still belonged somewhere. Vera wanted a war, she was about to get one. But first, I needed to find some allies, because going up against Ecolux Properties in their environmental compliance initiative was going to require more than just righteous indignation and family sentiment. I needed someone who understood the system well enough to beat Vera at her own game. Lucky for me, I was about to discover that I wasn't the only one in Lakeshore Harmony who had a problem with Vera Langford's version of progress. The third letter arrived on a Friday, and this time I didn't even bother getting angry. Vera had escalated to a complete construction moratorium. No repairs, no maintenance, no improvements of any kind until my cabin passed a comprehensive structural and environmental compliance review that would cost me $5,000 just to schedule. My roof was starting to leak from the October storms, but according to the letter, any attempt to fix it would result in additional penalties for unpermitted construction activities. Vera wasn't just trying to buy me out anymore, she was trying to make my cabin uninhabitable. That's when I met Reuben Hartley. I was walking around the lake, trying to clear my head and figure out my next move, when I noticed smoke coming from the chimney of a tiny cabin tucked back in the trees on the far side of the development. It was smaller than my place, probably built in the same era, but it had somehow escaped Vera's attention. Either that, or its owner was better at flying under the radar than I was. The man who answered my knock was probably 70 years old, with wild gray hair and the kind of deep tan that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades and jeans that were held together more by stubbornness than thread. "You must be Granger," he said before I could introduce myself. "Heard you were having some trouble with our self-appointed neighborhood improvement committee." His voice had the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who didn't miss much. Reuben Hartley turned out to be exactly what I needed. A retired attorney who'd spent 30 years specializing in HOA law and property rights. He'd moved to the lake 15 years ago to get away from the legal profession, but he'd been watching Vera's systematic takeover of Lakeshore Harmony with the fascination of a chess master studying an opponent's strategy. "She's good," he admitted, pouring me a cup of coffee that could have stripped paint. "Probably the most sophisticated property acquisition scheme I've seen in 3 decades of practice. But she's also gotten cocky, and cocky people make mistakes." Over the next 2 hours, Reuben walked me through Vera's entire operation. Ecolux Properties wasn't just a development company. It was the center of a web of interconnected businesses and organizations that Vera had created to give herself maximum leverage over property owners. The Regional Environmental Compliance Initiative, the Lakeshore Harmony Architectural Review Board, the Community Beautification Trust, they were all Vera, just wearing different hats and using different letterheads. "The beauty of it," Reuben explained, "is that she's created a system where she can attack you from multiple angles simultaneously. Environmental compliance, architectural standards, HOA regulations, community improvement requirements. Most people get overwhelmed trying to fight all these different battles at once. They give up and take her buyout offer because it seems easier than dealing with the bureaucratic maze she's created." But Reuben had been documenting Vera's activities for months, collecting evidence of the systematic campaign she'd waged against non-compliant property owners. He had recordings of HOA meetings where she'd discussed problem properties and strategies for encouraging voluntary compliance. He had financial records showing the suspicious relationships between Ecolux Properties and its various subsidiary organizations. Most importantly, he had proof that the Regional Environmental Compliance Initiative had been using fabricated data to support its citations. "The septic system report they sent you?" Reuben pulled out a thick folder and showed me a side-by-side comparison. They claim they took groundwater samples from 6 different locations around your property. Problem is, 3 of those locations are under 12 feet of water, and one of them is in the middle of County Road 47. Either they've developed some pretty impressive underwater drilling equipment, or they're making up their data as they go along. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. Vera's environmental compliance initiative was sophisticated enough to fool most people, but she'd gotten sloppy with the details. When you're fabricating scientific data to support bogus environmental citations, you should probably make sure your sampling locations actually exist on dry land. Ruben had more. Financial records showing that Ecolux Properties had purchased the 12 previous problem properties for an average of 60% below market value, then flipped them within 6 months for substantial profits. Email chains discussing acquisition targets and compliance strategies. Most damning of all, he had documentation of Vera's real plan for Lakeshore Harmony. Not just a luxury eco-community, but a destination resort with vacation rentals starting at $500 per night. She's not trying to preserve the lake community, Ruben explained. She's trying to turn it into Disneyland for rich people who want to pretend they're roughing it in nature. Your cabin is the last piece of the puzzle, the final property she needs to complete her resort development. Once you're gone, there won't be any actual residents left, just tourists and vacation rental properties. The scope of Vera's ambition was breathtaking. She'd essentially figured out how to gentrify an entire lake community while making it look like environmental protection. Local families were being systematically priced out and regulated out, replaced by wealthy tourists who would pay premium prices for a sanitized version of the lakeside experience. It was brilliant, profitable, and completely destroying the authentic community that had existed here for generations. But Ruben had also discovered Vera's weakness. In her eagerness to create a comprehensive regulatory framework, she'd overreached. Some of her citations were based on regulations that didn't actually exist. Others violated state laws protecting historic properties. Most importantly, her systematic targeting of specific properties could be challenged as discriminatory enforcement of selective regulations. The key, Ruben said, is not to fight her on her terms. Don't get bogged down in environmental compliance reviews and architectural standards. Challenge the system itself. Prove that she's created a fraudulent regulatory framework to support an illegal property acquisition scheme. He handed me another folder, this one even thicker than the first. Everything you need is in here. Property records, financial documents, regulatory violations, evidence of discriminatory enforcement. But you're going to need help presenting it. That's when Ruben told me about his ace in the hole. Before retiring to the lake, he'd spent 5 years as a consultant to the State Historic Preservation Office, helping communities protect historic properties from inappropriate development. He still had contacts in the state government, people who would be very interested to learn about a property acquisition scheme disguised as environmental protection. There's a process for getting properties listed as locally significant historic sites, he explained. It's not easy, but it would make your cabin untouchable. No HOA regulations, no environmental compliance requirements, no architectural review standards. Once a property is designated as historically significant, all those local regulations become legally irrelevant. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had a plan. Vera Langford might have money, organization, and a sophisticated understanding of property law, but she'd made the classic mistake of every overconfident opponent. She'd assumed her victim would play by her rules. Instead, I was about to change the game entirely. As I walked back to my cabin that evening, carrying Ruben's folders full of evidence and strategies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Vera had been systematic, methodical, and ruthless in her campaign to acquire my property, but she'd also been sloppy, overconfident, and ultimately too clever for her own good. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back, and this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. Ruben's evidence was devastating, but as I spent the weekend going through his files, I realized we were dealing with something much larger than a simple property acquisition scheme. Vera Langford wasn't just trying to flip a few lakefront properties. She was orchestrating the complete transformation of our region into a luxury tourism destination. And my cabin wasn't just an obstacle to her plans, it was the keystone that would bring the whole structure crashing down if she couldn't eliminate it. The financial records painted a picture of breathtaking ambition and careful planning. Ecolux Properties was backed by international investors, specializing in eco-luxury destination development. They'd already invested $12 million in the Lakeshore Harmony project, with plans to expand to 4 other lake communities in the region over the next 5 years. But the entire development was structured as a tax-advantaged historic preservation project, with Vera claiming massive tax credits for preserving the natural character of the lake, while simultaneously bulldozing every authentic piece of that character. My cabin was more than just an eyesore in Vera's perfect community. It was evidence that her claims about historic preservation were fraudulent. As long as my 60-year-old authentic log cabin existed, anyone could see that her historically accurate reproductions were just expensive fakes. The state and federal agencies providing her tax credits would start asking uncomfortable questions about whether they were funding actual preservation or elaborate theater. That explained the escalating pressure and increasingly desperate tactics. Vera wasn't just trying to maximize her profits by acquiring my property. She was trying to prevent the collapse of a multi-million-dollar development scheme that depended on my cabin disappearing before anyone noticed the contradiction between her marketing materials and reality. Ruben had also uncovered the human cost of Vera's vision. The 12 families who'd been forced out weren't just former property owners, they were the core of the lake community's year-round population. Vera hadn't just acquired their properties, she'd systematically eliminated the social infrastructure that made Lakeshore Harmony an actual community rather than just a collection of expensive houses. Armed with this understanding, I drove to the county courthouse to begin applying for historic preservation status for my cabin. My cabin was a perfect example of mid-20th century lakeside recreational architecture, built by local craftsmen using traditional log construction techniques that were rapidly disappearing from the region. More importantly, it was the last unmodified example of its type in the area. Every other cabin from the same era had either been demolished or so heavily renovated that its original character was lost. While I was filling out paperwork for the historic preservation application, I also started reaching out to the families who'd been forced out by Vera's systematic harassment campaign. Most of them were reluctant to talk at first. They'd signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their buyout deals with Ecolux Properties. But when I explained that I was fighting the same battle they'd lost, and that I had evidence of the fraudulent tactics Vera had used against them, they started opening up. Tom Henderson was particularly helpful. He'd kept detailed records of every citation, fine, and compliance requirement that Ecolux had thrown at them before they finally gave up and sold. His documentation showed a clear pattern of escalating harassment that matched exactly what I was experiencing. Even better, he'd discovered that several of the environmental citations they'd received were based on regulations that didn't actually exist. Vera had simply made them up and counted on the families being too intimidated or overwhelmed to fact-check her claims. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive picture of Vera's operation and a strategy for fighting back. The historic preservation application would protect my cabin from her regulatory harassment, but more importantly, it would expose the fraudulent nature of her entire development scheme. Once state investigators started looking into the contradictions between her preservation claims and her actual practices, the whole house of cards would start collapsing. But I also knew that Vera wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd invested too much money and reputation in the Lakeshore Harmony project to let one stubborn cabin owner derail her plans. As I prepared to submit my historic preservation application, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to find out just how dirty Vera was willing to fight when her back was against the wall. The war for my cabin was entering a new phase, and this time the stakes were much higher than just one family's property rights. I thought I'd seen Vera at her worst, but I was wrong. When someone threatens a multi-million-dollar development scheme, they don't just escalate their tactics, they go nuclear. The letter that arrived Monday morning wasn't from the HOA or the Environmental Compliance Initiative. This one came from Crawford Hartwell & Associates, the kind of white shoe law firm that charges $500 an hour to intimidate people like me into submission. The legal threat was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Ecolux Properties was prepared to file criminal charges against me for willful destruction of community environmental resources and fraudulent misrepresentation of property compliance status. I could face up to 5 years in prison and $50,000 in fines if convicted. But the real kicker was buried in the third paragraph. Vera had obtained copies of my divorce proceedings and was threatening to use my history of financial irresponsibility and domestic instability as evidence of my unfitness to own lakefront property. The message was clear: surrender now or watch me destroy not just your property but your reputation, your freedom, and any hope of maintaining a relationship with your daughter. It was psychological warfare disguised as legal documentation, and it was brutally effective. For the first time since this whole mess started, I seriously considered giving up. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, staring at Lana's contact information on my phone. She was 16 now, old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough that a father with a criminal record would be genuinely damaging to her future. Maybe the smart thing was to take the buyout offer and find another way to rebuild my relationship with Lana. But then my phone rang, and it was Lana herself. "Dad? Mom told me about the trouble you're having with the cabin. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you for fighting back." Her voice was stronger and more mature than I remembered. "That place means something to me too. Grandpa taught me to fish from that dock." We talked about school, her plans for college, about the environmental science class where she'd learned about greenwashing that companies like Ecolux use to disguise profit-driven development as ecological protection. Most importantly, she understood what the cabin represented. "Dad, you taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Don't let them win just because they're making it personal. That means you're winning and they're scared." After we hung up, I felt clarity for the first time since this whole battle began. Vera could threaten me with prison, bankruptcy, or public humiliation, but she couldn't change the fundamental facts. My cabin was legally and morally mine, her regulatory framework was fraudulent, and her development scheme was built on lies and intimidation. The next morning, I called Ruben and told him I was ready to go all in with our historic preservation strategy. No more playing defense, no more responding to Vera's escalating threats. It was time to take the offensive and expose her entire operation for what it really was: a sophisticated property theft scheme disguised as environmental protection. Ruben had been busy while I was wrestling with my conscience. He'd submitted preliminary documentation to the State Historic Preservation Office, and they'd agreed to conduct an emergency review of my cabin's eligibility for protection. Even better, they'd discovered that Ecolux Properties had been claiming state and federal tax credits for preserving historic lakeside architecture, while simultaneously trying to eliminate the only authentic examples of that architecture still in existence. Vera made a critical mistake, Ruben explained. She got greedy and applied for preservation tax credits based on her fake reproductions of historic cabin architecture. But to qualify for those credits, she had to certify that no authentic examples of the architectural style still existed in the area. Your cabin proves that certification was fraudulent, which makes her entire tax credit application a federal crime. By Friday, we had assembled a comprehensive dossier documenting Vera's illegal activities and submitted it simultaneously to the State Historic Preservation Office, the State Attorney General's Office, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. We'd also scheduled a community meeting for the following week to present our findings to the remaining residents of Lakeshore Harmony. But Vera wasn't finished with her psychological warfare campaign. Saturday afternoon, I found her waiting for me in my driveway when I returned from grocery shopping. She was wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, but the polished corporate facade was gone, replaced by something rawer and more desperate. "Mr. Granger, this has gone far enough. You're fighting a battle you can't win, and you're going to destroy yourself and hurt your daughter in the process. I know what it's like to lose the place that means everything to you. Don't make me do to you what was done to me." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Vera wasn't just a ruthless developer. She was a deeply damaged person who'd spent her adult life trying to heal childhood trauma by controlling everything around her. But understanding someone's pain doesn't excuse their crimes. "You're right about one thing," I told her. "This has gone far enough. But I'm not the one who needs to surrender. You've built your empire on fraud, harassment, and intimidation, and it's about to come crashing down." Vera's expression hardened, and for a moment I saw the scared 12-year-old girl who'd watched her family's world get bulldozed. But then the corporate mask slipped back into place. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said quietly. "I've invested everything in this project. I'm not going to let one stubborn old man and his rotting cabin destroy what I've spent years building." She got back in her Mercedes and drove away, giving me a look that made it clear our conversation was far from over. The community meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Tuesday at the Lakeshore Harmony Clubhouse. But I knew Vera would try to control the narrative by stacking the audience with her supporters. That's why Ruben and I arrived at 5:30, along with Tom Henderson and 3 other families who'd been forced out by Vera's systematic harassment campaign. We weren't there as supplicants. We were there as prosecutors, presenting evidence of her crime. Vera had clearly been preparing for this confrontation. She arrived with a lawyer, a woman with a camera, and someone who looked like security. She'd also packed the room with people I'd never seen before. probably employees from Ecolux Properties pretending to be concerned community members. But Ruben had been preparing too. He'd invited a reporter from the county newspaper and a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office. Most importantly, he'd arranged for everything to be recorded by an independent court reporter. The meeting started predictably. Vera welcomed everyone and explained that we were there to address some concerns about community development standards. She presented a slideshow of beautiful photos showing renovated cabins and pristine lakeshores, talking about the success of the Lakeshore Harmony project and the bright future ahead for the community. But then Ruben stood up and politely requested permission to present an alternative perspective. What followed was 20 minutes of methodical demolition of Vera's entire operation. He presented evidence of the fraudulent environmental citations, the fabricated regulatory framework, the systematic harassment of non-compliant property owners, and the criminal tax fraud that had funded the entire development. The room went dead silent as Ruben laid out document after document, proving that Ecolux Properties had been operating an elaborate criminal enterprise disguised as community improvement. But the real bombshell came when Ruben introduced Mrs. Kowalski and played the recording of her conversation with Vera. The room heard Vera's voice, clear and unmistakable, threatening to make life very difficult for any property owner who refused to comply with her demands. Vera's composure finally cracked. She jumped to her feet and started shouting about illegal recordings and invasion of privacy, but the damage was done. Everyone in the room had heard her true voice, seen her true character. The polished corporate facade had been stripped away, revealing the predator underneath. That's when something unexpected happened. Real residents started standing up and telling their own stories. The Martinezes had been fined for having a vegetable garden that allegedly violated native landscaping requirements. The Johnson family had been threatened with legal action for installing a swing set. Even some of the newer residents who'd initially supported Vera's vision were expressing doubts about the increasingly authoritarian enforcement of arbitrary regulations. The meeting that was supposed to be Vera's opportunity to publicly discredit me had turned into a community uprising against her entire regime. People were angry, and they were finally feeling safe enough to express that anger publicly. The representative from the State Historic Preservation Office was taking detailed notes, and the newspaper reporter was interviewing residents who'd been afraid to speak out before. But Vera had one last card to play. She stood up, restored her composure, and made an announcement that caught everyone off guard. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand there are some concerns about our community standards. That's why I'm pleased to announce that we've invited Governor Patricia Williams to visit Lakeshore Harmony next month to personally present our community with the State Ecological Excellence Award. The room buzzed with surprise. Getting a visit from the governor was a big deal, and the award was prestigious recognition that would bring significant tourism and investment to the area. Vera was trying to regain control of the narrative by reminding everyone of the benefits her development had brought to the community. But Ruben just smiled and pulled out another folder. That's interesting, Vera, because I happen to have a copy of the application Ecolux Properties submitted for that award. Would you like me to read the section where you claimed that no authentic historic cabin architecture remained in the Lakeshore Harmony area? Because Mr. Granger's cabin is mentioned specifically in the State Historic Preservation Office's preliminary assessment as an outstanding example of mid-20th century vernacular lakeside architecture. The implications hit the room like a physical force. Vera had committed perjury on her award application, claiming that authentic historic architecture had been successfully preserved, when she'd actually been trying to eliminate the only authentic example that still existed. If the governor showed up to present an award based on fraudulent documentation, it would be a public relations disaster. The representative from the State Historic Preservation Office stood up and addressed the room directly. I want everyone here to know that our office is conducting a formal investigation into the claims made in Ecolux Properties award application. We've also forwarded our findings to the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. That was the moment when Vera's empire finally started crumbling in real time. Her lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear. The people she'd brought to pack the meeting were suddenly very interested in examining their phones, but the real residents of Lakeshore Harmony were energized. People were exchanging contact information, talking about forming a real community organization, making plans to support each other. As the meeting broke up, Tom Henderson came over and shook my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "We should have fought back when she came after us, but we were too scared. You showed us that she's not invincible." But the most meaningful moment came when Lana walked through the door. She'd driven down from her mother's house without telling me she was coming. "Dad, I wanted to be here for this. I wanted to see you stand up for our family and our community. As we walked out together, I realized that we'd accomplished something much more important than just protecting my cabin. We'd shown an entire community that they didn't have to accept abuse disguised as authority, that they had the power to resist systematic intimidation, and that fighting back was not only possible, but necessary. Vera's Mercedes was already gone from the parking lot, but the real residents were still there, talking and planning and building the kind of authentic community that Vera had been trying to eliminate. 3 weeks after the community meeting, I was sitting on my cabin porch with Lana, watching her paint the window trim that had been peeling for months, when a black SUV with government plates pulled into my driveway. For a moment, my heart stopped. After everything that had happened, unexpected official visitors still made me nervous. But the woman who got out of the passenger seat was smiling, and she was carrying what looked like a certificate instead of handcuffs. Margaret Chen from the State Historic Preservation Office had driven down personally to deliver the news that my cabin had been officially designated as a locally significant historic property. The designation meant that no HOA regulations, environmental compliance requirements, or architectural review standards could be applied to my property without approval from the State Preservation Office. Vera's entire regulatory framework was now legally irrelevant to me. But that was just the beginning of the good news. The FBI's investigation into Ecolux Properties had uncovered a pattern of fraudulent activity across 3 states. Vera had been systematically eliminating authentic properties while claiming tax credits for historic preservation. The total amount of fraudulent tax credits exceeded $2 million, making it a serious federal crime. Vera had been arrested the previous week at her office. The local newspaper had run a front-page story with a photo of her being led away in handcuffs, looking nothing like the polished corporate executive who tried to intimidate me into selling my cabin. Ecolux Properties had been seized by federal marshals, and all of its assets were frozen pending criminal prosecution. The families who'd been forced out by Vera's harassment campaign were getting their properties back. The federal government was voiding all the sales to Ecolux Properties on the grounds that they'd been obtained through criminal fraud. Tom Henderson was already making plans to reopen his bait shop, and the real Lakeshore Harmony Homeowners Association was being reconstituted with actual community members instead of Ecolux employees. Even better, the State Ecological Excellence Award was being transferred from Ecolux Properties to the authentic community preservation effort that residents were organizing. Governor Williams would still be coming to visit, but she'd be recognizing the residents' success in protecting their historic lakeside community from fraudulent development schemes instead of celebrating Vera's fake preservation project. As Agent Martinez was leaving, she paused and looked back at my cabin. You know, Mr. Granger, your refusal to be intimidated probably saved a lot of other communities from the same kind of fraud. Vera Langford was expanding her operation rapidly, and she might have destroyed dozens of authentic historic communities if you hadn't fought back when you did. That evening, I got a phone call that completed the circle of justice. It was from a lawyer representing Vera Langford, asking if I'd be interested in purchasing her former residence in Lakeshore Harmony at a significantly reduced price. Apparently, she needed to liquidate her assets quickly to pay for her legal defense. I bought Vera's house, but not to live in or rent out. Instead, I worked with the State Historic Preservation Office to convert it into something called the Memory House, a place where kids from low-income families could spend summers learning about authentic lakeside living, traditional cabin construction, and genuine environmental stewardship. It was everything Vera's fake eco-luxury resort had pretended to be, but real and accessible to the kind of families who'd originally built these lake communities. The first group of kids arrived in June, and watching them learn to fish from my grandfather's dock, helping them build traditional log furniture using hand tools, it felt like the perfect way to honor both the authentic community we'd saved and the traumatized child that Vera had once been. Lana decided to spend the summer at the cabin, helping me run the Memory House program and working on a documentary about our fight against Ecolux Properties for her high school environmental science project. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded through Vera's lawyer. She was in minimum security federal prison, serving 18 months for tax fraud and conspiracy. The letter was reflective and, in its way, grateful. Mr. Granger, she wrote, I needed to tell you that you were right to fight back. I spent so many years trying to control everything around me because I was afraid of losing what mattered, but I ended up destroying the very thing I thought I was protecting. Your Memory House program is what I should have created from the beginning. I never wrote back. But I did frame the letter and hang it in the Memory House, next to a photo of young Vera crying in front of the bulldozers that destroyed her childhood cabin. It serves as a reminder that trauma can drive people to do terrible things, but it can also inspire them to do better. if they're given the chance to heal and learn. Today, my cabin looks exactly the same as it did when this whole mess started. Weathered logs, creaky porch, and all the authentic imperfections that Vera had tried so hard to eliminate. But it's also become something more than just my family's retreat. It's the heart of a genuine community that values authenticity over perfection, inclusion over exclusion, and shared experiences over manufactured luxury. The kids from the Memory House program come back every summer, and some have started bringing their own children. Governor Williams did come to present the State Ecological Excellence Award, and she spent most of her visit talking to the kids about what real environmental stewardship looks like. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, watching families enjoy the lake in the way it was meant to be enjoyed, I think about what would have happened if I'd given up and taken Vera's buyout offer. But I didn't give up, and neither did the other residents who found the courage to fight back against systematic intimidation. We learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought for personal gain, but for the preservation of something authentic and valuable that benefits everyone. We learned that communities are stronger than corporations, that truth is more powerful than expensive marketing, and that ordinary people can defeat seemingly invincible opponents if they're willing to stand together and fight for what's right. My cabin is still here. Still imperfect, still authentic, and still serving its original purpose as a place where families can connect with each other and with the natural world. Vera Langford tried to turn our lake into a luxury theme park, but instead she accidentally helped us rediscover what made our community special in the first place. And as Lana said one evening while we watched the sunset from our porch, "Dad, this whole experience taught me something important. Sometimes the best way to preserve something is to share it, not to control it. And that, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, feels like justice finally coming home where it belongs."
You watched it. You felt it. Now share it with someone who loves drama even more than you. That's the QA Stories way.